Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, you are watching Remstar Says So. Okay, guys, let's get right into this. Today's video is a fan requested video. One of my subs messaged me yesterday and asked me to make a video for him, given my outlook on what I think the current situation was within promotional companies and networks. So today's video is really about, do promoters and networks have too much power and influence over the governing bodies? Let's get right into this one. Um, I think that a lot of these promoters and networks, I think they do have a lot of influence and power. I'll give you my first example off the bat. Bob Arum and Frank Warren are pretty much the two powerhouses responsible for bringing the WBO into a real world title sort of belt. Once upon a time, before the WBO was sort of recognized as a world championship, it was sort of recognized more like a Mickey Mouse belt, sort of like what the IBO belt is now. Bob Arum and Frank Warren really sort of worked with the WBO and pushed for their fighters to constantly fight for WBO titles until the WBO sort of became recognized. And because of that, if you've noticed down the years, Bob Arum fighters and Frank Warren fighters always have held WBO titles. Anthony Yard currently holds two of the minor WBO titles and is now the mandatory. Um, Once upon a time, when sort of Frank Warren and Mick Hennessy were doing like a joint venture with Tyson Fury, Tyson Fury was the WBO mandatory for Klitschko, and that's how we got the unified belts off of him. Billy Joe Saunders, WBO middleweight title. Terence Crawford, WBO welterweight champion. He was I think the first belt that Terence Crawford won at junior welterweight was the WBO before he went on to sort of unify and become undisputed in that category. So yes, I think wholeheartedly, especially within the WBO themselves, I think that there's a lot of sort of influence from the promoters and the networks. Another example I could give you guys is Eddie Hearn and Anthony Joshua. These two are the second biggest money generators in boxing after Canelo Alvarez. Once upon a time, I know you Matchroom fanboys aren't going to want to hear this, but Luis Ortiz was the WBA regular champion. Luis Ortiz was supposed to get his mandatory shot at the championship, and Eddie Hearn and Matchroom basically refused to fight Ortiz, and they said that Luis Ortiz the WBA could come and strip them of that belt if they wanted to, because they were supposed to start negotiating with Ortiz, and they point blank refused to take the fight because back then Ortiz was still regarded as a killer. Matchroom and Eddie Hearn said, "Look, if you want to strip us, come and strip us." And AJ and Eddie Hearn were prepared to like have that belt taken from them. But what happened was the WBA saw how much money AJ was paying every 6 months in sanctioning fees and decided to turn a cold shoulder and let AJ get away with his fucking bollocks. So because of that, Luis Ortiz didn't get his title shot, and that's why he ended up going over to fight Wilder for the WBC championship. You could also say Wilder's had a lot of influence too. Let's not forget, Dillian White wanted to fight Deontay Wilder for the WBC championship, and Deontay Wilder publicly stated to White that if he beat Ortiz, he would give him a title shot next. Within about 2 or 3 weeks, the WBC then turned around and said to Dillian White the exact same thing that Wilder told him: fight Ortiz and we'll make you the mandatory challenger. Obviously, we all know that Dillian White didn't want any of that smoke, so the fight never happened and he never became the mandatory challenger. Let's not forget, guys, title holders are supposed to take a mandatory challenge once a year. Deontay Wilder just went the whole of 2018 without filling a mandatory obligation. In 2018, at the back end of 2017, he took out mandatory opponent Bermane Stiverne. In March 18, he took on Luis Ortiz in a very good match, and then December 2018, he fought Tyson Fury. Deontay Wilder only fights twice a year, so in 2018, Deontay Wilder didn't take on a mandatory fight. He went an entire year, so that sort of went against what the governing bodies sort of look for. What else? What other sort of BS can I see that sort of goes around? I think one governing body that does try to sort of stick to things is the IBF. They have been quite strict over the years. I'll give you an example. When the Golovkin and Canelo fight fell through, um, Golovkin was supposed to defend his IBF title in a mandatory fight, and he decided to go and fight some random Mexican. I think it might have been Vanis Manaroshan or something like that. And the IBF stripped him of that belt. So there are certain cases where certain governing bodies will definitely look to sort of govern how they should do. The fact is, it's hard for a governing body to not give favoritism and not do this and not do that. An example would be Canelo Alvarez. He failed a drug test, blamed it on contaminated meat that he ate in Mexico, even though it's widely known that Canelo Alvarez is about 90% vegetarian. But he just happened to eat random meat from a random restaurant in Mexico while he was pumping drugs into his system. Canelo Alvarez was given a slap on the wrist and a 6-month ban, which means that all that really happened to Alvarez was that he missed one fight. Instead of fighting two fights, he missed one fight. Instead of fighting two fights in the year, he only fought once. Didn't really make any difference. Like, yes, I definitely do agree um, that fighters, boxers, networks, they have a lot of sort of say and push over the governing bodies. I think the biggest issue and the reason why this shit happens is because the governing bodies, they're just too easily bought. I'll give you an example. The WBA had their championship belt, and then what they wanted to do is they wanted to get more greedy. So they went and made a regular belt and a super belt, so that they could have supposedly two legitimate world champions in most of their weight categories. You've got the WBC that have got all these little fucking BS belts. You got the WBC championship. Then every so often you hear them making a WBC Diamond Championship, the International, the Silver. It's so confusing. All these little minor belts do is give fighters an opportunity to pay to get themselves ranked in the top 15. There's too much corruption and bribery within these things. The fact is, when your players like Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, you're big money earners, and the WBC is always going to, you know, turn the blind eye with the people that put the most money back in their pockets through sanctioning fees. When you look at some of the other divisions, like, Keith Thurman, he's been stealing a living for the last couple of years, fighting once a year. Keith One Time Thurman should have changed his name to Once a Year Thurman. Like, I don't really understand what's going on in the division, but yes, I do think that a lot of people have too much outside influence, um, and I think that it is sort of ruining the sport. The sort of thing where it's like people aren't getting title shots. I saw a video of Eddie Hearn on his favorite propaganda channel a couple of weeks ago, and he said that the likes of Adam Kawanowski and other upcoming heavyweights should come and sign with him in the zone if they want to get title shots against AJ, because it's not likely that they're going to get it without. Like, you shouldn't be able to have that much power and say this, but realistically, unless you become mandated challengers, AJ's not going to choose you for a fight. So he's got a point. You're going to make as many in-house fights as you can. And with a stable like Matchroom, who have just launched Matchroom USA, you got the likes of Big Baby Miller, Dillian White, upcoming heavyweights on that roster as well. You know, AJ can keep cherry picking who he wants to. We're already hearing Matchroom talking about Eddie Hearn setting up a fight between AJ and Usyk. I've already made a video saying I don't believe Usyk has any business down or coming up to heavyweight. But yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of control and influence on these governing bodies by the fighters, the promoters, and the networks. I think that boxing is a very corrupt business. Um, And I think it's only going to keep getting worse because there's so much more money getting thrown around. You're seeing DAZN offering Deontay Wilder 20 million to fight Brazil, and then 40 million a pop against AJ. You know, Canelo Alvarez has just signed a 365 million pound deal. Golovkin's just signed a $200 million deal. There's so much money in boxing right now that the fighters and the promoters are definitely going to be at the wheel, sort of influencing these governing bodies. And it's not right because other people aren't getting a look in. But just like any other industry, money talks. In every business, you always look after your cash cows and the people that generate the most money, and boxing is no different. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Do you agree with me? Do you think that the boxers and the promoters in the network have too much influence over these governing bodies? Do you think that, boxing is very corrupt? Do you think that fights may be fixed? Leave me a comment, hit like, hit subscribe. That's the end of the show because Rem Star says so.